Everybody. I hope that you are well and also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our grade 6 English lesson on simple, compound, and complex, right? So simple, compound, and complex. And before we start our lesson, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 6. And then we're going to scroll up until we get to the chapter of simple, compound, and complex sentences. All right. So our chapter is simple, compound, and complex sentences. Our subject is English, which is language arts. Grade 6. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of simple, compound, and complex sentences is to identify dependent and independent clauses, and is the sentence simple, compound, or complex. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. All right, so now we're going to start, right? So a clause. So when it comes to simple, compound, and complex sentences, right, we start with a clause, and a clause is a group of words that contains both a subject as well as a predicate, right? A subject that tells us who they are talking about, and the predicate is the action that they're doing. So then we have dependent and independent clauses, right? And an independent clause is a complete thought. So an independent clause, it is a complete thought. So firstly, we said a clause is a group of words that contains both subject as well as a predicate. And an independent clause is a complete thought, meaning it has both subject as well as predicate, right? And an independent clause, it can stand alone as a sentence. So an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence. Then we have a dependent clause, right? So a dependent clause, it is not a complete thought, and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. So an independent clause is a complete thought that can stand on its own, right? It has both subject and predicate. And a dependent clause is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. If we look at the clause, right, or the sentence that says, let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. This is basically a clause that can stand on its own. And a clause that can stand on its own, we call that an independent clause. And then we have after Kevin gets off work. There it's missing something, which means that this clause cannot stand on its own. So it is a dependent clause. And during the course of this lesson, we are going to find out how we can even join and link up an independent as well as a dependent clause, right? An independent clause which can stand on its own, and a dependent clause which is then added or linked up with the independent clause, and how we can then form a sentence with that. So a complex sentence, right? It is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. So this is what we were mentioning now as to how we can link up both independent as well as a dependent clause. So which we call that a complex sentence. So a complex sentence, it is made up of both an independent clause which can stand on its own as well as a dependent clause which cannot stand on its own and it needs an independent clause, right? An independent clause, right, within a complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. And an example of subordinating conjunctions, right, it's like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, or while. So once again, a complex sentence, it is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause, right, which cannot stand on its own, right? So dependent clause in a complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction, which is after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, or while. And an example of a complex sentence, right? Let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe after Kevin gets off work. So now, if we identify the independent clause within that sentence, then we will say it is let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. That is the independent clause, right? Then we have a dependent clause, right, which cannot stand on its own and it needs the independent clause, right, which is after Kevin gets off work. And as you can see, the word after. So the word after, it starts with a subordinating conjunction. So let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe after Kevin gets off work. All right. So we said that a independent clause, it can stand on its own. It is a complete thought. A dependent clause is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence, right? But if we put those two together, we put the independent clause as well as the dependent clause together, right? We call that a complex sentence. Because a complex sentence, it is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause within that sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction, like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, or while. All right, so now we see that we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. So we are going to aplusstudents.ca, and we said our chapter is simple, compound, and complex sentences. And now we're going to the first lesson, which is to identify dependent and independent clauses. And once again, we said an independent clause can stand on its own and it expresses a complete thought. A dependent clause cannot stand on its own and it does not express a complete thought. So we now need to select the dependent clause within the sentence. And remember, we said that we can basically join the dependent as well as independent clause, right? And if we join that dependent as well as an independent clause, we call that a complex sentence. So complex sentence, it's where we basically join the independent as well as the dependent clause. It's like we put it together in one sentence. And then the dependent clause, right, which cannot stand on its own, that dependent clause, it usually starts with a subordinating conjunction. So now we need to select the dependent clause. Until Carl took a sewing class, he couldn't even thread a needle. So until Carl took sewing class, he couldn't even thread a needle. And remember, we said that a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. So within the sentence, right, if we identify the dependent clause, we can say it is until, because it starts with the subordinating conjunction, until Carl took a sewing class. That is our dependent clause, and it stops just there. Let me rather circle it. Chantal Cole took a sewing class. That is our dependent clause. So we need to also select the dependent clause in the next sentence. It says, when the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre in 1911, the theft wasn't discovered for more than 24 hours. So we need to select the dependent clause. And if we select the dependent clause, we can then say when the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre in 1911, or Louvre in 1911. That is our dependent clause. So now we also need to select the dependent clause. When Dalton and Gwen arrive, we can watch Gone with the Wind. So when Dalton and Gwen arrive, we can watch Gone with the Wind. And if we select the dependent clause, we can say when Dalton and Gwen arrive. That is our dependent clause. And remember, we see that dependent clause, it does not express a complete thought and it cannot stand on its own. And if we basically have that clause or sentence where we have both independent and dependent clause in one sentence, right? And then our dependent clause, it starts with our subordinate, or it starts with a subordinating conjunction. And we call that a complex sentence, where we have both independent as well as a dependent clause in one sentence. All right, so now we're going on to our test, where we're going to identify dependent and independent clauses. So we need to select the independent clause, right? Remember, we said an independent clause, it basically expresses a complete thought and can stand on its own. Although Tess had been running late all day, she still made it to the meeting on time. So although Tess had been running late all day, she still made it to the meeting on time. So we need to select the independent clause. Is it although Tess had been running late all day? Or is it the second option, which is she still made it to the meeting on time? And if we select the independent clause, right, you will say she still made it to the meeting on time. And that is the independent clause. The second option, she still made it to the meeting on time. So we need to select the independent clause. After mom got a new job at the hospital, my older brother made our dinners for us. So after mom got a new job at the hospital, my older brother made our dinners for us. So we need to select the independent clause. Either the first option, which is after mom got a new job at the hospital, or is it my older brother made our dinners for us? And if we select the independent clause, we can say my older brother made our dinners for us. And that is the independent clause. My older brother made dinners for us. We need to select the dependent clause, the dependent clause. And remember, we said a dependent clause, it does not express a complete thought and it cannot stand on its own, right? And it starts with a subordinating conjunction. And if we select the dependent clause, right, it says Brittany had never heard Farsi spoke until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood. So Brittany had never heard Farsi spoken until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood. So if we select the dependent clause, right, is it option one, which is Brittany had never heard Farsi spoken? Or is the second option until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood? And if we select the dependent clause, we will say until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood. Starts even with a subordinating conjunction, and that is the dependent clause. So we need to also select the dependent clause, right? Before we moved to our new apartment, my sister and I shared a room. So the dependent clause, is it before we moved to our new apartment, or my sister and I shared a room. Clause. So before we moved to a new apartment, or my sister and I shared a room. The dependent clause. The dependent clause. Remember, we said a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. It starts with a subordinating conjunction. Look at the word my sister. What does that start with? And I look at the first word, the first sentence, which is before we moved. The word before. Remember, we said a dependent clause, it starts with a subordinating conjunction. And a dependent clause is the first option, right? Which is before we moved to our new apartment. So it's the first one, right? Because remember we said that a dependent clause, right? It starts with a subordinating conjunction, right? And it does not express a complete thought. Like it does not have both, let's say, subject and predicate in it. So it depends on the independent clause in order to make it a complete sentence. And that is why we call it a complex sentence. So the first one is the correct one. All right. We need to select the independent clause, right? Although he may seem a little shy at first, Ernesto has an outgoing personality. So we need to select the independent clause that can stand on its own. It expresses a complete thought. It has both subject and predicate. Is it although he may seem a little shy at first, or is it Ernesto has an outgoing personality? So which one is the correct one, the correct independent clause? Yes, so if we select the independent clause, then we will say it's Ernesto has an outgoing personality. So well done. That one is correct, right? All right, so that was us identifying dependent and independent clauses, and we see that a dependent clause does not express a complete thought and it cannot stand on its own. And we said an independent clause, it can stand on its own and expresses a complete thought. But if we basically put the independent clause as well as dependent, as we put, if we put the independent clause as well as the dependent clause together into one sentence, right? And then we create a complex sentence, right? And we say the dependent clause, it basically starts with a subordinating conjunction. All right, so now we're going on to the second lesson, which is the sentence simple, compound, or complex? So we need to say if it's a simple sentence, a compound sentence, or a complex sentence. And we already found out now that a complex sentence is where it has both independent as well as dependent clause within that one sentence, right? That is a complex sentence. And we said a clause is a group of words that contains both subject as well as a predicate, right? And we then mentioned that an independent clause is a complete thought and it can stand alone as a sentence. And an independent clause is not a complete thought, so it cannot stand alone as a sentence, right? For example, the oranges on our tree are ripe. That is a independent clause because it can stand on its own, right? It expresses a complete thought. And then after we pick up Kevin from work, this is a dependent clause that cannot stand on its own. It does not express a complete thought. And it also starts with a subordinating conjunction, which is after. All right, so now a simple sentence, right? A simple sentence is made up of a single independent clause, right? Remember we said an independent clause, it expresses a complete thought and it can stand on its own. So a simple sentence, it is made up of a single independent clause, only one sentence that is an independent clause. For example, Ben and I, which is our subject, spent all day relaxing by the pool. So within that sentence, we have a subject as well as our verb, which we can identify, our predicate, right? So they said some of the simple sentences have introductory phrases, but the introductory phrase is part of the predicate. For example, in the winter, that is basically an introductory phrase. Now we start with our subject. Ben usually wears his heavy coat. Or we can just say Ben usually wears his heavy coat in the winter, right? But still, this is a simple sentence. It is a single independent clause that can basically stand alone. It expresses a complete thought. It has both subject as well as a predicate in. Then we have a compound sentence, right? And a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses, which is then joined by a coordinating conjunction. And remember a coordinating conjunction, right? It's words such as and, but, or so, right? That's coordinating conjunction. And then we have subordinating conjunctions, right? Which is after, although, as, because, before, right? So you need to know the difference between a coordinating conjunction as well as a subordinating conjunction. And that is not to confuse you, right? So we said a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses, which means that both of these sentences, they can stand on its own. But we are now joining that two sentences, right? By adding our coordinating conjunction, which is and, but, or. So we can use any one of that. For example, we saw a flash of lightning, which means that this is one independent clause. Here we have our coordinating conjunction, which is and the second independent clause is seconds later we heard the rumble of thunder. So which means that these are two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is and. So it says, we saw a flash of lightning, and seconds later, we heard the rumble of thunder. So that is a compound sentence, which is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as and, but, or so. And then again, we have a complex sentence, right? And it is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, or while. And remember, we said that there's a difference between a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. Remember, a coordinating conjunction, it is used to join two independent clauses, whereas usually a subordinating conjunction, it is usually in front of or the start of a dependent clause. So it's the start of a dependent clause. So we need to know the difference between and when to use a coordinating conjunction as well as a subordinating conjunction. For example, if she ever gets the chance, Terry would love to visit the Egyptian pyramids, which means that Terry would love to visit the Egyptian pyramids is our independent clause. And then our dependent clause that starts with a subordinating conjunction is if she never gets the chance. So this is our dependent clause. All right. So there we found out what a simple sentence is, which is made up of a single independent clause. We have a compound sentence, which is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And then we have a complex sentence, which is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And it is the dependent clause, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. All right, then before we go on to our test, right, we said a clause is a group of words. It contains a subject as well as a predicate, right? An independent clause is a complete thought. It can stand alone as a sentence, which means that it contains both subject as well as a predicate. And a dependent clause is not a complete thought. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. It does not express a complete thought. It does not have both subject or predicate. And usually, before, like when we start a dependent clause, right, we start with a subordinating conjunction. So now we're going to begin our test where we're going to say, is a sentence simple, compound, or complex? So we need to now select the simple sentence, which has a single independent clause. Although it snowed all weekend, there was still not enough snow for skiing. So although it snowed all weekend, there was still not enough snow for skiing. Or is it freedom of speech and trial by jury are two important rights in the United States Constitution? We need to select the simple sentence. So option 1 or the second option. All right, and if we select our simple sentence, we can select freedom of speech and trial by jury are two important in the United States. That only has a single independent clause. So, which is a simple sentence? In 1900, the US state with the largest population was New York, or while Shireen was interviewing the governor, she uncovered plenty of information for her article. So, option 1 or option 2. And if we select the simple sentence, we can say in 1900, the US state with the largest population was New York. All right. So that is now the end of our lesson on simple, compound, and complex sentences, right? We said, and the first one is correct. Sorry for rushing, but the first one is correct. So well done, right? So now we are coming to the end of our lesson on simple, compound, and complex sentence. I really hope that you have a more broader understanding now of what a simple, compound, and complex sentence is. We see the simple sentence, it consists of a single independent clause which can stand on its own, right? And it expresses a complete thought. A compound sentence, it consists of two independent clauses, right? Which is then joined by a coordinating conjunction. And then we have a complex sentence, which is then it has both independent as well as dependent clause. And the dependent clause, it usually starts with a subordinating conjunction, right? And remember, we also said that a dependent clause, it cannot stand on its own because it's not expressing a complete thought, whereas an independent clause can stand on its own because it expresses a complete thought. So that is now the end of our lesson on simple, compound, and complex sentences. Thank you for joining the class. Thank you for interacting. Until next time, have a good day further. Goodbye.